Morning to you all, and welcome to this week's Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. Well, as somebody who used to love reading 19th century as a student, I was always impressed by a book by A.J.B. Taylor called The Troublemakers. What Taylor was talking about was a number of European politicians in the late 19th century who didn't want to overthrow the European order. They weren't revolutionaries like Lenin and the Bolsheviks, but they weren't happy with what Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany would have called his place in the sun. They wanted to make adjustments. They wanted to assert their naked national interests, and they weren't worried about holding up the system, freezing decision making until they got their way. Now, I suppose in more colloquial modern English, we would call this the awkward squad. And every family, of course, has its black sheep. And anybody who studied international organizations will know that there's always an outlier somewhere in the system who basically can disrupt proceedings. Think of the General de Gaulle in NATO from the 1960s onwards, taking France out of NATO's military command structure. Think of Mrs. Thatcher, the old former British Prime Minister, waving her handbag at EU budget meetings and demanding, "I want my money back," and so on and so forth. But at a time when organizations like NATO and the European Union really have their backs to the wall, facing the onslaught of the authoritarian states launching aggression like Putin in Ukraine, or trying to limit the foreign policy influence of the West on the wider scene, or busting international sanctions, for example. It's more serious when NATO and the EU have their black sheep who hold up decisions and disrupt proceedings, the modern day version of the awkward squad. And there are three countries in particular which are often talked about in this connection: Turkey, Hungary, and now possibly a third, Slovakia. Turkey, of course, has long been in this particular category. It's maintained strong relations with Russia and has received a lot of Russian economic and energy investment, particularly in developing Turkey's nuclear industry. Turkey has refused to impose sanctions for the war on Ukraine against Russia. It's been buying up Russian military equipment, notably the S-400 air defense system and other technologies. It's also held up for a year Sweden's membership of NATO at a particularly difficult time in terms of NATO returning to collective defence. Although, to be fair to the Turks, finally yesterday, good news for NATO, the Turkish Grand National Assembly finally did go ahead with the ratification, leaving only Hungary now as the outlier that still has to complete that particular process. But in holding up Sweden's ratification, President Erdogan asked for all kinds of concessions. Some had to do with Sweden, like, for example, getting the Swedes to lift their arms export embargo against Turkey, or to change their laws on terrorism, to outlaw the PKK, pro-Kurdish party. But a lot of Erdogan's demands had nothing to do with Sweden whatsoever, like concessions from the Americans on F-16 aircraft sales and spare parts, like getting Canada to lift restrictions on the export of drone technology to Turkey, or similar with the Netherlands as well, or even insisting that the EU speed up membership negotiations with Turkey overall. Turkey also has in the past imprisoned American pastors, German journalists, as well as many Turkish journalists as well. And the European Commission did not give Turkey a particularly favourable write-up in its recent enlargement report when it came to Turkey moving ahead to meet the conditions, particularly in the field of human rights, for eventual Turkish membership of the European Union. In other words, Turkey has given every sign of taking a rather transactional approach to its membership of international organizations. What can we get out of them being first and foremost the issue. Also Hungary, which is often called by many here in Brussels an illiberal democracy. In the 13 years that Viktor Orban has been in power, he's gone from being a young liberal and anti-communist campaigner to being very much an authoritarian in the style of the system that he once so fervently condemned, monopolizing the media, increasingly in the hands of the government, for example, making elections very polarized affairs indeed, and of course also drawing closer to Russia and China. Holding up packages of EU sanctions for months at a time. And more recently, Orban has not only held up Sweden's membership of NATO. Hungary is the last country, as I said, to complete this process of ratification, even though Orban said for ages that Hungary would not be the last country. But it has recently been holding up 50 billion euros, which the EU wants to give to Ukraine, and which is at the present time, with Ukraine under a lot of military pressure from Russia, absolutely vital for Ukraine's ability to withstand Russia, to manage its economy, its administration, and so on. Although, again, Orban has recently made a couple of olive branch gestures to Brussels by suggesting that Hungary would allow this money to be transferred, subject to a stringent auditing and annual reviews. Now, Orban just yesterday said that he would invite the Swedish Prime Minister, Ulf Kristersson, to go to Budapest for a final discussion, a negotiation on Sweden's membership of NATO. The Swedes, I think, quite naturally have rejected this, saying there's nothing to negotiate. We've been accepted as members of NATO. Hungary has voted for that in the past. Hungary has agreed that we have the status of an invited member at the NATO Council table. And what is there to negotiate as well? And then we have Slovakia, where the leader of the populist Smear party, Robert Fico, was returned to power for the third time in October, saying immediately that he would cancel Slovakia's military assistance to Ukraine, although it's okay for Slovak companies to do business with Ukraine if it is for economic profit. And he's also condemned a military aid to Ukraine as only prolonging the war. He wants peace immediately. And yesterday he announced that he would not travel to Kiev and would prefer to meet his Ukrainian counterpart on the Hungarian-Ukrainian border instead, saying that, in his view, Kiev was a perfectly normal city where nothing particularly was happening. Although, for my part, I've noted 967 air alerts over the past year. Just yesterday, Russian missiles once again were launched against Kiev. So when we're dealing with these three countries that clearly are holding up the business, are refusing to impose or sanctions, are not holding up the rule of law or other democratic principles on which NATO and the EU are based, how do we deal with them? Well, it's not easy, of course, because whereas it's difficult to join these organizations, there's no provision for them to be asked to leave or even to have their membership suspended, unlike, for example, in the United Nations. So they have to be accommodated in some shape or form. But I think there are 5 principles moving forward that need to be borne in mind. Number 1 is don't buy your way out of trouble. I personally think it was not really correct for the EU to grant 10 billion euros to Hungary, even though it had not met the democratic standards, as a kind of an inducement to try to persuade Orban to go ahead with the decisions on Ukraine. This kind of concession for little in return doesn't solve the problem. It only encourages these outliers to demand more or to think that their transactional approach, putting pressure, is going to work. The second principle is don't compromise on values. And where there are mechanisms, for example, in the EU to impose sanctions like on Poland or Hungary or others, for backtracking from the rule of law or democratic standards, it's important for the credibility of these organizations to go ahead and impose those sanctions so that non-cooperation does have a price at the end of the day, and the countries that use it cannot be the economic beneficiaries The third principle is find workarounds. If it's clear that Hungary is going to block progress in the EU, hold up decisions, for example, on the 12th package of sanctions against Ukraine, the EU in advance, EU governments have got to think about, well, how can we work our way around this? For example, one idea was that if the Hungarians would not allow the EU to use its European peace facility to buy weapons for Ukraine, then individual countries could use this money on a national basis, not through the EU, to supply those weapons. This may be one idea, but find creative ways to get around the problem so that the EU is still capable of action. A fourth idea is institutional reform, that as the EU goes forward with admitting Ukraine, Moldova, states in the Balkans, and EU reform is on the table, that reform has to have a much higher element of qualified majority voting, particularly on foreign policy issues like EU common security defence operations, which, of course, are very timely and very, very urgent indeed. So more majority voting and backtracking from the previously universal unanimity rule as well. But at the end of the day, we also have to be pragmatic and distinguish between those disruptors who have great geopolitical importance for the West, like Turkey, and that we need to cooperate with and work with, particularly when it comes to Russia, the Middle East, or who can act as bridge builders and diplomatic bridge builders, like Erdogan has done in negotiating 2 years ago the Ukrainian-Russian grain deal, and those disruptors without geopolitical influence as well. So there's no easy answer to the disruptors, but on the other hand, there's no reason either, while they should be permitted and allowed to disrupt business of the democracies at a time when it's more urgent than ever that those democracies are fully functional. Thank you for listening today. Look forward to our next encounter on keeping an eye on the geopolitical ball.